Welcome to alchemist.camp, where we learn Elixir by building things. Last time we built a really simple Phoenix app. Its whole purpose was basically just to put users' names in the URL instead of ID numbers, which is the default behavior. This time we're going to tackle another frustration for a lot of new users of Phoenix, which is when you have a field that's more complicated than a scalar data type, like a string or a number or a date time. Ecto can actually handle collection types. So you could have a field in your schema that is a map, an Elixir map, that gets represented in your database as JSONB or JSON, depending on the kind of database you have. Or you could have a field that's an Elixir list that gets represented as an array in the database. And in both those cases, the generator will work, but you won't be able to use the related forms. So we'll change this hobby field into hobbies. And then instead of it being a single string, it will now be an array of strings. And as you might guess, we're going to have to make a migration to change the database itself. Let's actually do that right now. So we'll mix ecto.gen.migration, and we'll call this alter users hobbies. Then inside our priv directory, we should have a new migration. Here it is. And instead of change, we're going to use up and down. We'll make two separate migrations to explain what should happen exactly. We'll alter table users, and we'll remove, let's see, in the up migration, we'll remove hobby, and we'll add hobbies, and that's going to be an array of strings. And the down migration is basically just going to be the opposite of this. So I'll copy the entire thing. And we'll remove hobbies instead of hobby. And we'll add hobby, which is just a string. Okay, that should work. And of course, we've lost the data that was in hobby because we removed the entire column. So when we reload, that was a bit premature. Actually, probably better make sure that all the copies of hobby throughout the app have been replaced by hobbies first, and then of course restart the server. So hobby comes up 25 times. Okay, so we'll definitely use the mass replace here, and we'll we'll replace the capitalized ones first. Yes, all two of them. And then the lowercase hobby will be replaced with lowercase hobbies. Let's run that search again. 23 left. As expected, yes, replace them all. Okay. So now we should be able to start the server. And we're still going to have problems because we're going to have null data instead of a hobby in that field. Oh, they just haven't been saved. All right, we'll save them all. Okay, there we go. So we got Sam, we got the hobbies. We can't actually put a hobby in here though. So say we add skiing as a hobby. Something went wrong. This is invalid, and that's because we've got to put in an array type. And even if we'd used a generator from the beginning, we'd still be running into an error whenever trying to edit a user. And that is because the form helpers in Phoenix don't cover how arrays or maps are handled. So let's take a look at the forms that we do have. So inside our templates for our user. Okay, so we have this text input that doesn't work because we need an array instead of text. We'd see in the terminal the request that was sent in had just the string skiing instead of an array with one element being the string skiing. So let's build up an array input step by step here. First thing is we've got to think about what the interface should be like. I like the idea of just having a list of items, since an array is a list, and however many already exist in the database will be displayed, and there will be a button to remove the ones that we don't want or to add a new one, which we could then fill in. Or you could just edit the ones that are already there in place. I also considered doing a text area where you just split on lines and make each line another input. I think that would actually be a faster interface, but it would require a little bit more knowledge to know how to use it. So the first step is we're going to make it so that we can create one list item and have it submit a valid array of a single item. To start, we'll make a new view helper that will be where we make our array input ultimately. We have an error helper, and we'll just put the input helper in the same views directory. So we'll call this one by name web dot input helpers. And we're going to use phoenix.html. This is the macro that injects a lot of the functionality that, the other helpers use. We'll go full screen here just so we have enough space. We'll make a function called createLi, and this will just create an HTML list item. And like the other helpers, it'll take the form, and it'll take a field, and it'll take input options. But if they're not there, it just assumes it's an empty list of keyword options. And it'll take existing data, and same deal there. First, we'll have to determine what kind of array we're dealing with. In other words, is it an array of strings? Is it an array of date times? Is it an array of floats or something else? So there is a built-in function to do that, and we'll use it. It's called input type, and it just takes form and the field. So if we pass in a form and then a field, it will check what kind of type that field is and return a type that we can use. Next, we'll generate a name. And Phoenix has an almost identical helper to help us do that. In fact, the syntax is the same. We just have to use a function called input name, and we're going to append this to the end of it, which is how you denote an array in an HTML form. Then finally, we'll handle our input options. And if there's no name in the input options, we'll put the name that we've generated here into them. So put new will not overwrite an existing option with that name, but if there isn't one called the one that we're putting in, it will put that in. So you can basically think of this as our default name. And then to generate the HTML, we use a function called content tag. Then to generate the HTML, we'll use a function called content tag. It's going to be a list item, and everything you put inside of the do just becomes a sub-element of that tag. So inside that tag, we're going to have an input that is of the type that we got passed into the function. So in our case, it's going to be a text input, and we have to pass it a few options. One is the form, which we've already taken in our function. Another is a field, which we also took in as an argument into our function. And then finally is the options, which we took in and possibly added a name to if there wasn't one. And we're going to have another child under the list element. So we'll have a list element. Inside that list element is going to be an input tag, and we'll also have a link to a remove button, or actually just a remove link. And that'll just go to pound because we're going to deal with it with JavaScript. And it'll have whatever data was passed into the parent function, and it'll have a title of remove and a class of remove array item. Oops, looks like that got whacked. All right, save that. So this is pretty basic, but it's actually usable already. We can go into the form and change this text input into a create li. And looks like there's still an error there, and that's because we don't even have access to this. So normally all of the helpers are included into your app through a macro in web.ex, but this is a new one that we made ourselves, so it's not there yet. We'll just add it. In my name web, or whatever your app is, web, you have various imports that are put into all of your controllers or all of your views. You want to be judicious what you add here, but we really do want our input helper in all of our views. With that change, now this create li should be findable. Unless there's a typo. Oh, we're missing a comma. There we are. Now when we edit it, now you notice the hobbies looks a little different, and we have an input. Then under the input, we have a remove link, and let's actually go into the browser so we can see exactly what's happening here. So we have an li, and then inside the li, there's an input and a link, just like we have here, content tag li, input, and a link. This remove button does nothing since we haven't hooked any JavaScript up to it yet. But we can type in skiing and submit it, and it actually saves the hobby. The reason for that is what was submitted was an array containing the string Sam. When we inspect the element again, we can see the name of this is user open bracket hobbies close bracket open bracket close bracket. So that's an array. Okay, step one is done. We're going to use this create li function as a building block, and we'll make a function that calls it and creates lots of li's. This one will be called array input, and it'll take a form and a field, and that's it. First thing we're going to give it is an ID, and once again there's a helper with almost the same syntax, so we're just going to copy that. And this ID is default, and we're going to add underscore container to it. So it's going to look like user hobbies container. Next, we want to get the values from all of the inputs inside of the input array. And there's a function we can use to do that, which once again looks very much like the others, so we'll just copy that line down again, and it's called input values, or input value. Actually, it's not quite the same because I'm going to call the variable value. And in the case that there are no inputs, we want to make sure we still have an array type, not a null, because a null would cause some bugs. So we'll do that. Then this array input is going to have a content tag of OL. And it's going to have an ID of the ID that we calculated above. And it's going to have a class of input container. That's in case we want to style all the input containers in the same way. And inside of this content tag, we'll create an LI for each value. So we'll use for comprehension, and we need an index. So value and index. And we'll get that from enum with index of values. And basically, it will just be our create li function. We're going to pass it form, field, and input ops, which we still have to specify. And we'll give it an index of I. And remember, this index is, or this last option is data. So we're going to pass a data attribute to each of the LIs. And it's just going to be data-index of 0, data-index 1, data-index 2, as we add more and more lines to this array. The input options are going to be the value of whatever the value was of that item, and ID of nil, because otherwise they'll all get the parent's ID, and we'll have an array of many list items that all have the same ID, which is not valid HTML. It's compiling, so let's give this a try. We'll use our custom array input, and we're not going to use a form control class. And this looks a little bit more array-like. And to make sure that this really is working properly, let's edit the data from the terminal. So first we'll alias by name.core, and sam equals core.get user sam. We should be able to just pass that to core.update user. Sam, and hobbies is now going to be skiing and music. Okay. Refresh that, and now that looks a lot more like an array edit. If we submit that, all works. Display's a little bit odd, that's okay. We can just change that in the show, set it to, let's see, we'll have to make sure that it's not nil, because we can't use an enum on nil. So we'll say if user.hobbies is nil, then we'll display nothing. Otherwise, we'll display enum.join user.hobbies and commas. Okay, there we go. That's a more reasonable display. And just to check, hiking and music. Very good. We'll make the same change on the index. And we don't have the at. Okay. Hiking, music, hiking, skiing. So next task is to make it so that we can, so the remove does something, and so that we can add new ones. We'll go back to our input helpers, and we'll make an element that will be our add button. We'll call it array add button. Like the other things, it'll take a form and a field, and we're going to use exactly the same ID creation as we have here. Then we're going to grab the link that we used for remove and clone that as well. But now instead of being a remove link, it's going to be an add link. Let's see, any other changes? Nope, we're going to go exactly with that. And the data we pass this link is going to do a lot of work for us. We're going to create the list element that we want to be added when this button is clicked and store it as a data attribute as HTML. We'll call this attribute blueprint. And we'll use the create li, form, field. And since this is a new field that we're creating, it's just going to have a value of an empty string. And then, since we can't just put this into HTML, we're going to pass this through safe to string. And this will just make sure that it's an HTML safe string. And we'll make a second data attribute called container. And that's just going to hold the ID of the container. So this button is only a link. Notice there isn't a content tag in here anywhere. It's just this link at the bottom, but the link has a data attribute which includes the HTML for an li, which is essentially just like the LIs we're making in our array input, except that it has an empty value. In order to make this a bit more concrete, let's add this into our form so that you can see what it looks like. We'll just put it under our array input like so. Array add button. And it still takes the same arguments as the array did. So now we have this add button. If we inspect this, I'm not sure I can make the, I can make the font for that bigger. Excellent. It's actually so much that it's cut it out, but the data blueprint attribute is the whole li, which is the same structure as these other LIs that we've already got in there. One more thing to point out before moving on from here, though, is if you look at each of these items, this data index is on the input. And in each of these list items, we have two elements, first an input, then a link. All right, so our JavaScript is in assets, JS, app.js. Get rid of all these comments here. So this would actually be a lot easier to do with jQuery or React or Vue or something, but just to keep it to the lowest common denominator, I'm going to do this in plain JavaScript. So we'll need a window onload. That will do some stuff. And I'm going to make a helper, which is basically just because it's so much of a pain to deal with what you get back from document query selector all, since it's not a real array. This is basically just a combination of for each and document query selector all. So we have a selector and a function, and we use array.prototype.forEach.call. So this is how you use an array's for each on something that acts like an array, but it doesn't have access to for each. And document.query selector all which, as you probably know, is pretty much like what you get from the jQuery dollar. So basically this will do a document a query selector all on some query selector, and then it will apply the function to each of the things that the query selector matched. And the reason I did that is because we're going to use it for remove array item. So everything with the remove array item class we're going to take that element and set its onClick to a function called remove item, which I haven't defined yet. And remove item is going to take, it's going to be a function that takes that incoming event. First, it'll get the index out of it. So event.target is going to be the element, and then we'll get the data from the data set .index. So that's going to correspond to what we have here, this data index 1. So it'll get the index. Then we'll get the li, which is event.target.parent node. The target itself is going to be the remove button, or the remove link. So the parent of the remove link is the li, and the ol is going to be the parent of the li. Then we'll remove the li, remove child. And once we remove the li, we'll update the index of all the children, since we're not using any sort of front-end framework to handle this for us. So array.prototype.forEach.call ol.children. So the ol.children is going to be all the list items under this. And this is an each with index. So x is the li itself. The first child of the li is going to be the input field. So first child dataset.index is the index that we've been using to find the items with. So we're going through all of the remaining list items and updating their indexes. Then after that, we've also got to set the total number of items on the ordered list itself. Okay, this in itself should work. Let's see if we can reload it and remove an item. I'll try to remove hiking. Submit that. Very good. Okay, so now to hook up add item. We'll do the same basic thing up here in the onload. We'll put listeners on all of the add array items, which there's only going to be one of. And it's going to be the same kind of deal. The el.onClick. And that's a really annoying pop-up. Gets in the way of seeing what's going on. Add item. Add item is a little bit more complex, but not too bad. So like remove item, add item is a function that takes an incoming event. However, we're not going to use target. Actually, all we're going to use is the data set. So we'll just pattern match the function head as so. And we'll use that target from the data set. Actually, I should show you what that is just to make it clear. So we can see this data container, user hobbies container. And user hobbies container is the ID of this entire list. So if there were lots of list items, there would just be one container above them. And we're going to use that to get the container element. And as before, we'll get an index. It's really not an index, it's really a length. Actually, yeah, what am I thinking? It's not an index, and this one's an index. Yeah, the OL doesn't have it. Okay, that's completely superfluous. Makes no sense. So I'm just going to call this one count. Then we'll insert adjacent HTML into the end of the container. The container is the ordered list, not element, just HTML. And we'll put it before the end, which means it'll be inside the closing OL bracket. And we'll take the HTML out of that blueprint data attribute. And we'll call this new item that we've just added, new item. That new item itself has two children. First will be the input, and the second will be the link. We're going to have to add an on-click listener to that link. Then in the form, we're going to set an index to the current count. We'll have to modify its ID to include the current index next. Put an underscore and the index. And finally, just as a convenience, we'll focus the input on that new item. That should do it. Let's give it a try. So skiing, hiking. The focus is not working. Index is not defined. Let's count. Hiking, boating, flower arrangement, listening to loud music, and ASDF. That's looking pretty good. All right. Well, it's not looking good. It's working well. Obviously, to make it look good, we'd have to do some styling, and I don't think that's going to happen today. Foo, bar, baz, and we'll try removing some here at random. And we'll add a whole bunch of blank ones. ASDF. QWERTY. Dogs. Looks good. All right, so there we have it. It's a fully functional form input for arrays, and all we have to do to use it in our forms is to add an array input and an array add button, passing each form and the name of the field, and that's pretty much it. It's a bit more work to do this for a map, but after this episode, you've probably got a good starting point on that as well, and we're going to call this a win. If you want to learn more about working with Elixir or Phoenix, hit the subscribe button, click the bell, and you will get more. Till next time, code on.